Hey everyone, welcome to Food Talk. I am so pleased to be here with Lisa Moon, who I consider a very dear friend. She's somebody I've known for about, I think, 14 years, Lisa. I don't want to date either one of us, but I think that's about the time we've known each other. Lisa serves as the president and chief executive officer of the Global Food Banking Network, which is an organization working with partners in more than 50 countries to recover and redirect food to those who need it. Lisa, thank you so much for being here.
Dani, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm wondering if we can start off by explaining to our listeners and viewers what the Global Food Banking Network is, what you do, and why that work is really important, especially right now.
Yeah, thanks, Dani. The Global Food Banking Network, or GFN for short, our mission is to nourish the world's hungry through uniting and advancing food banks. And we are actually coming up on our 20th anniversary
Oh, wow.
next year. And we were founded back in 2006 simply because there were people in communities all over the world that were noticing that a lot of very nutritious food was going to waste. And of course, we know, like at a macro level, that we throw away about a third of all the food that's produced. But at the same time, those were nutrients and that people in those communities really could need because they couldn't access it through the commercial supply chain. GFN was founded to really help those local leaders figure out kind of a plan to start a food banking organization. And we do that primarily through connecting these local leaders to others in different communities that are doing food recovery and redistribution well. And nearly 20 years later, we are so privileged now to work with this thriving grassroots network that last year served about 40 million people facing hunger.
40 million people. That's incredible. And I think sometimes, we think of it's interesting to me about food waste because it's something that like took a long time for people to understand and figure out
Yeah.
there's this growing awareness. But your organization was really at the forefront of this 20 years ago.
I think absolutely. I mean, in terms of it's food waste is tough because it's happening at every point in the supply chain. Like, it's happening on farms. We see it happening in our households. Like, it's a really big problem to get your arms around because
Right.
there's so many different players that are responsible for figuring out how we reduce it. But I think that what's been really exciting about this work and to see at least the community leaders that we work with, they're really zeroing in on places where there is a lot of healthy surplus. Like no farmer is wanting to let, like good fruit and veg rot in the fields or at the farm gate. Definitely, people selling product at central markets, certainly on the retail side, all of that food, a good portion of it can be used. And so food banks are there to be partners to help redistribute it safely to people that need it.
Absolutely. And I love the words, that you use, recovery and redistribution. It's not like, hey, we're donating this or donating that. It's really making sure that all of those good nutrients don't go to waste.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, food banks don't own food redistribution, of course, right? Like, and I know, Dani, one of the amazing things that you have done and that Food Tank is really blazing the trail on is how do we have a food system in the future that is sustainable, accessible, equitable, and not wasteful. And so I think
Mhm.
that given all the challenges that we're seeing in the world, how difficult it can be to grow food, especially in this climate landscape, we have to make sure we're using all of it that is nutritious and edible. And so we would love to see redistribution happening at a much larger scale, I think, as we're thinking about food systems in 10 years, 20 years, and beyond.
Right. That system thinking is really important. I want to dive into, one of the biggest causes of food waste is logistics, right? Logistical challenges and issues. Can you talk about what I think so many of us really don't understand what that means?
Yeah, so food loss that's happening prior to the retailer, right? A lot of that is due to, poor, just not a real understanding of what the customer ultimately wants, and then how
Mhm.
do we move food from the farm, all the way down through our, very large and international food system. And at every point in that supply chain, there are standards that have to be met. They want to make sure that food, of course, is safe to eat. And then a lot of
Mhm.
times, food companies also want to make sure it's going to be at its peak. And in terms of taste, and then we as consumers absolutely love our food to look perfect. And
Right.
so with all of those standards in place and those expectations, you're losing food at different parts of the supply chain. And that is kind of what I was mentioning before. It's kind of whose responsibility is that? Is that the
Yeah.
farmer's responsibility? But they, of course, have sold it. Now it's being transported and so it's a very difficult challenge to get your arms around in terms of how do we really prevent and reduce.
Absolutely. I want to dig into a little bit about one thing that I really love about GFN is that again, you're not focused on this idea of donating. You're working and collaborating with the food banks in your network and really bringing about this idea of dignity and ensuring that, the people you work with feel that when they are getting redistributed, recovered food.
Absolutely. So GFN, we're a network. We ourselves are not, moving the food. We are really existing to amplify the good work that's going on at the community level all over the world. And one of the coolest thing about working with local leaders is that they tend to adapt a proven model that has worked in a lot of different places and customize it to really meet the needs of their
Mhm.
communities. And so I think that again, because redistribution is all about what food is, nutritious, edible, just as good as what you would kind of get at the store or the market. I think that food banks and our networks are really committed to making sure that the food that they're making available is diverse, that it's
Mhm.
something that the client, even if they might face food insecurity, it's something that they want to be consuming,
Right.
that they want their children to consume and make sure they can do it in a way where there's choice involved with a lot of dignity. So, and this is, I mean, food sharing has gone back for literally generations all over the world. And that's really what I think food banking is about at the end of the day is how do we share the food that's available with others?
You talk about sharing, and I imagine that the food banks in your network learn a lot from one another. How do you facilitate that sort of sharing of information and not reinventing the wheel and sharing innovations?
Yeah, absolutely. Isn't it amazing what happens when you get a group of, I feel like, really good thinkers together? And so this is the primary offering of GFN, right? So we tend to connect, food bank leaders that are in a specific region, and they can meet, they can visit each other, and kind of see what operations look like in different places.
Right.
We also connect like-minded leaders globally. We have a program really focused on recovery from farmers and how do you partner well with small scale growers. That program is actually based out of Nairobi, just because we think that the model Food Banking Kenya is pioneering is just so innovative and interesting, and there's so much to learn from that organization in particular. But that's a global program. So you
Right.
have, food bankers from Latin America visiting with our food bank leads in sub-Saharan Africa, or our colleagues in the Philippines, traveling to Food Banks Canada or a Feeding America site in the States here, to see kind of what can we be doing differently. And we really think that that foundation of sharing is what is going to drive innovation and faster uptake of best practices.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the probably, from my perspective, one of the most important things you do is really connecting all of these different food banks to one another. You mentioned earlier, that we're living in a very chaotic climate landscape, right? And farmers are trying to adapt as much as they can. But what I like about food banks is they're providing more than food, right? They're providing one, a sense of community, and two, really resilience to some of these challenges, whether it's climate or conflict or political uncertainty.
Yeah. Absolutely. Food banking organizations, I think, kind of really look to try to strengthen communities in a couple of ways, or at least the ones that we have seen most prominently since the COVID pandemic. I think the first thing is that, when natural disasters or disasters of any kind strike, community organizations are increasingly being asked to respond. The United Nations organizations, I feel like UNHCR, World Food Program, these are amazing organizations, right? Like, and it's that the international organizations too, like Red Cross and ICRC, like these are groups that are absolutely incredible at providing relief during really difficult times. The challenge, though, is that the number of crises has completely spiked, that we
Right.
no longer have the bandwidth to be tackling the emergencies that we are seeing simply through kind of an international organization model. And so ever since the pandemic, we have seen community organizations needing to step up and wanting to step up. And
Right.
so I think that's like the first thing in terms of community resilience is we have seen food banks and our network be there on the front lines, providing aid when crises strike. And they're coordinating with local product donors, and they know kind of their communities and where people that are most at risk are based. And they also coordinate with government and regional players too. The second way I think that we have seen our members really kind of leaning into and supporting community resilience, especially in the past 5 years, is the social services that they
Mm,
are working with. Look, food is an engagement tool. I mean, school feeding is such a demonstration of this, right? Like we know
right.
when we offer meals at school that students are more likely to attend, stay in school longer, especially girls. And so the same principle holds true for other types of services that people need that might be harder to access. And so our network at least works with about 60,000 social service agencies to
Wow.
distribute food through them to engage with communities on health services, on job training,
Wow.
childcare, education, really vital social services that they cannot access through the government. And so I think in these ways, food banks are really looking at how can we strengthen the social fabric of a community and kind of lift up families and individuals so that they're able to have not just the food that they need to thrive, but the
Right.
services, the knowledge, and the opportunities that they need to thrive.
And it goes back to that systems thinking that you mentioned before, thinking of this as a wider system, not just something that's siloed, that this really has to be a part of what's happening in a community, in a country, and around the world. You also mentioned, that emergencies of every kind are increasing, right? And again, whether it's climate, conflict, whatever else, it's a challenging time. And I'd like to take a step back, and if you could sort of maybe give our listeners an overview of what's the state of food insecurity, nutrition insecurity, hunger in the world today, and how did we kind of get here?
Yeah. I mean, in 2015, and Dani, you know, because you were part of these conversations, we as an international community set a really bold goal that we wanted to zero out all forms of hunger, malnutrition, and food insecurity by 2030. And I think we were really, I think it's right to be, very ambitious with these targets. But the real sad reality of this is that there have been setbacks and progress.
Right,
Right. And so we are now just 5 years away from that goal. And it is actually looking like the state of food insecurity and hunger in the world is just as challenging as it was 10 years ago,
right, right,
if not even a little bit worse. And there's a lot of different reasons for this, right? So we know that right now we have over 700 million people that are struggling daily just to access the calories that they need to survive. If we take a step back and say, kind of how many people are facing food insecurity. They might have access to food on an irregular basis, but it's something that really is a challenge for them to access. They're having to make tough choices between paying school fees or paying for food, or paying for health services or housing or paying for food. And
right.
that number is about 2.3 billion people,
Mm,
according to the FAO. And then if you look at the people that could afford a nutritious diet, that number that cannot afford, excuse me, a nutritious diet, that number is sitting about 2.4 billion people. And what I think is so interesting about this is that if you look at food and nutrition insecurity, this is something impacting most every community on the planet. This is not something that is just isolated in certain regions. And so we all have a role to play, I think, in thinking about how can we, as people, if we are as parents, as community leaders, and certainly for those of us working in the social services space or in the business space, how can we be seeing food insecurity addressed in a sustainable way as part of food systems transformation?
yeah, you're right. It's something we all need to be thinking about. It can't just fall on one organization or one government's sort of plate. It has to be on all of our plates to be thinking about these things. I know GFN didn't get money from the federal government here in the United States, but I wonder how the recent cuts to the U.S. Agency for International Development and, cuts at other government agencies, how you feel that will affect one, the state of hunger that we just talked about, and two, the role that GFN plays in helping solve these issues.
Yeah. So obviously, I feel like since for the past 30 years, and even beyond that, if you're thinking about kind of the eve of official development assistance in the 1960s, government aid for both the US and from Europeans has played a really pivotal role in building out community capacity, and making sure people have the food, the healthcare, and the education that they need to survive and thrive. So obviously, the drawback of aid and the sudden drawback of aid is obviously, very detrimental. It does put lives and livelihoods at risk.
Yeah.
I know that there have been several numbers that have come out by the United Nations. And Danny, I think you actually talked about the most recent data on your podcast last week, I believe, that was saying that there's, close to 60 million people that are no longer able to receive life-saving food support as a result of those immediate cuts. Within the GFN network, and so we do have the majority of our network is in Central and South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and then South and Southeast Asia. We have about 15 members that are based in communities and countries that are really being disproportionately
Mm,
impacted.
mm,
For example, Food Forward South Africa, a long-standing food bank that's been in existence for 15 years, they have already begun to see the impact of the aid drawback. They were one of the largest recipients of actual health
wow.
aid from USAID, and this has resulted in significant economic distress. They're already seeing increases in demand for food relief, and we're just a few weeks out at this point. We have two food banking partners, one based in Kenya and another based in Ethiopia. And of course, those countries were already tagged as kind of hunger hotspots, especially as we're
Right.
moving into a more difficult climate season. So within sub-Saharan Africa, obviously the biggest impact has been that people aren't able to access food or health services, and food banks are already seeing increases in demand. The other place, though, that we are seeing a lot of changes is in Central America and parts of
Mm,
South America.
mm,
And we already know, of course, that the border crisis between the United States and Mexico has been challenging for many, many years. And so you just have a lot of migration already in that region. And there were some services set up south of the United States border, that were providing support to migrants. And a lot of those services were impacted by the reduction in
yeah.
aid. And so what we're hearing from our colleagues there is they're incredibly concerned about the hunger crisis, because there's families that are displaced. They may not speak the language. They certainly don't know the culture. They're very vulnerable. Oftentimes, they're women and children. And so that's the other area that we are keeping an eye on to see how we might be able to provide support through food banks in the region.
Absolutely. Do you think that philanthropy and the private sector can help fill this void, or is it too immense? The sort of the hole left by USAID.
You know, it's such an incredible gap. It would be very difficult to say especially within a short notice period within the next few months, that we would be able to galvanize the volume of resources necessary to continue service provision like we saw, in 2024.
Mm,
However, that should not that should not prevent us from moving forward with great urgency. We know, as I'm thinking about the crisis that we're facing, first of all, we know that there are people that are in these communities that are deeply committed to serving their neighbors, right? So we have people and organizations, local organizations on the ground that are there, and they are committed to making changes and providing as much service as possible. And so I think this is a moment for, to think about how we can, of course, support support the good work that was happening prior to this aid withdrawal, but
Right.
also look to new allies within communities that are going to be based there and have shown sustainability, and see how we can be investing in a way that allows them to proceed with a very targeted support
Right.
service during a time where it's going to be very, very difficult to meet all of the need that has been created by this.
Yeah, that is encouraging, and I've heard examples of community leaders all over the world, really stepping up. It's unfortunate that they had to in quite this abrupt way, and I
Right.
feel like so many unnecessary challenges and some cruelty happening here. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on tariffs and how that will affect the work that GFN does.
Yeah, I think since, for the past 6 years, the food supply chains have been disrupted on such a regular basis. I feel like we have so much of our food supply moving through international trade. And so when you have inflationary pressures, right, we know that food inflation is still much higher than inflation overall in nearly every place in the world. And we know that there are being disruptions in logistics even before the tariffs were put into place. We have these conversations about, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, like all sorts of logistical issues related to shipping and ports and those types of things. And then, of course, the tariffs is another dimension that is going to impact the trade of food and agricultural commodities. And I think ultimately, what we're looking for is, of course, is how is this going to impact pricing, and the availability of nutritious food at the right price. But the other thing I think that this could impact as well is the amount of food that is going to waste. You have a lot of food that is exported, in an uncertain tariff environment. That could mean that you have perfectly good food that doesn't get from one place to another, and you have that surplus that is discarded.
Yeah, that again, the complexity of all this, the challenges that so many are facing is incredible, and all these unintended consequences that you pointed out from tariffs. I want to switch gears a little bit because in addition to the work with your networks on the ground, GFN does really important research, and you recently released a report analyzing food waste policies in three different countries. And I'm wondering what you found and what were you like? Were you surprised by certain things, or what were your thoughts as you were reading the research?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Danny. So that project, which we called the Policy Atlas, we do it with an amazing legal clinic based out of Harvard, and they have been looking with GFN for the past 6 years at what policies could be put into place that might encourage companies and producers to donate food instead of throw it away. And what we have found through that research is that there's a couple common sense, no cost policies that governments can undertake that dramatically impact donations. So the first one, of course, would be liability protection. If you donate food in good faith, you don't have to worry about being sued potentially for that. And we have seen several countries adopt that legislation over the past 6 years. We also have seen really good results from having clarity on date labeling. Kind of, this is something, Danny, you've talked a lot about. Is when is food really not too dangerous to eat, and making sure that you are aligning date labeling with when it's edible versus when it might be best able to eat. The most recent research, though, that you're referencing has to do with what we call waste deterrence policies. And so these are increasingly popular, especially in Latin America and parts of Asia, because we just have an enormous amount of food waste ending up in landfills. Like 50% of everything going into landfills is organic waste. Most of that's food. And that is causing a big issue because it creates methane gas, and that's contributing to, obviously to the warming of our planet and so many of the climatic events. And so we've been looking, of course, at incentive-based policies to reduce organic waste, but this looked at waste deterrence policies. So it kind of took a look at the French law that was passed a couple of years ago that says, hey, you have to donate your
Right.
surplus food. If it's edible, you cannot discard it. It also took a look at the South Korean policy that actually puts the burden on consumers. It says, hey, consumers, if you're going to throw away food, you're going to have to pay a specific tax on it. And then it also looked at a Peruvian law that was required donation with
Mhm.
no potentially with no excuse me penalty for throwing food away, but a donation requirement. And so what I think we are learning for waste deterrence is that you really have to understand the legal framework and the political climate within a certain country because
Right.
what works really well in some places may not work in others.
Yeah.
So
No cookie cutter approaches. You have to really understand local context for sure.
yeah.
You talked a little bit about the Harvard Food Law Policy Clinic. Why was it important for GFN to have that relationship?
Emily Broadleaf and her team at the Food Law and Policy Clinic, they had done such incredible work on US food loss and waste policy, not just at the national level, but also at like the state level and the city level. And we built the research on that. And so it's been amazing to have kind of that legal team working
Right.
with, of course, food bank leaders in our network and their legal counsels. And then we had DLA Piper has been our longstanding law firm, and they have firms all over the world.
Oh, wow.
So they were able to offer kind of a legal opinion that was specific to the country where we were doing the research. So
So
um,
important to have those connections, those academic
yeah.
connections, those legal connections. Lisa, you have advocated for a banner agency that pulls stakeholders together to tackle the issues of food loss and waste. Why would this be important?
I think, food loss and waste, right, we've talked about just, it's a very broad-ranging issue. And it touches a lot, if you're looking at it from the government level, it touches a lot of different ministries, right?
Mhm.
And then people have different incentives and reasons for wanting to, kind of see the issue resolved. If you're a grower, I mean, and you're, growing this food that is not getting to market, it's an income. I mean, it's a lost income opportunity.
Right, right.
Obviously, if you're a business leader and you have surplus that is being discarded, there's disposal fees. And then depending on where your business is based, of course, we're seeing now a real focus on wanting to move to, net zero footprints and things like that. And so I think you have to get these interests together and really put together a very focused action plan.
Yeah,
Where that sits in government, I think it could depend on what the government is. I think if you look at Chile, right, the Ministry of the Environment is really leading their food loss and waste reduction policy. While if you look at Brazil, it's more sitting in the agriculture,
Mhm.
ministry. So, but I think this is a multi-sectoral issue, and we have to treat it as such. And it should be considered on the business side pre-competitive, for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. As we sort of, wrap up, I'm wondering, you talked about the Sustainable Development Goals and, what we hoped would happen and what can happen over the next 5 years. Do you have a call to action for, are the folks listening and as well as governments and food banks and other stakeholders around the world?
I think my biggest hope for the next 5 years and whatever commitments are made in 2030 and beyond, is that we would see a radical commitment to supporting local organizations. And Dani, I know you talk to local leaders every day, as this is obviously the strength of the grassroots network of GFN, but these are people that have incredible ideas. They are very creative. They know how to move work that seems impossible.
Right.
And they deserve, I think, the trust and confidence. They've earned it, and they deserve it from a dignity perspective to be at the center, I think, of our development agenda. And that's my call. I think that's it's going to be so important as we think about sustainable food systems in the future. And not just on food, but on other types of issues. But I would love to see the resources flowing, the voices that are being amplified at major international meetings,
Right.
and the solutions that are being celebrated really be centered around these local leaders.
I love that radical commitment, radical support, radical respect for the work that these people have been doing on the ground, for years and years. That's a great call to action. Where can folks find more information about GFN, Lisa?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. So you can go to our website. We are www.foodbanking.org. We would love to hear from you. And we also, if you, wherever you happen to live, if you want to get involved in food banking, you definitely can because you most likely have a local food bank just around the corner.
And if you can, please donate, especially right now to GFN. The work that they're doing is more important than ever before. So find that donate tab on the website as well. Lisa, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Danny, thank you for everything you're doing. Great to be here.
Thank you.